Hello and welcome. In this tutorial we are going to be using Cinema4D, the 2024.2 edition. And I have not made a series of tutorials in quite a while, but the interface has changed so much, and it looks like they've even gotten rid of the switch to change back to the old layout. And so it is time to update my tutorial series. Okay, so this tutorial, we're just going to be looking at the interface, going through where tools are, what different things are called, and some accessibility and a little bit of navigation. If you are taking this as, if you're watching this as part of the course, you do not need to upload anything for this tutorial to be completed. With the next one in the series, it will be obvious that you have done this because you are successful in the other tutorial. Okay, so let's get started. So once you open Cinema4D, by the way, the icon looks like that. If you're on a Mac, you can always go up to the Finder and click on the Spotlight search and do a search for Cinema4D. It should show up. Obviously, this is assuming you have installed the software already on your computer or you're using one of the lab computers. If you're on Windows, you can search down at the bottom right, and you should be able to find it there as well. In the lab computers, occasionally they will have multiple versions installed, and so just make sure you're using 2024. It could be 0.1 or 0.2. There's a couple small differences, but overall that will get you in the right place. So when we open Cinema and we have just a default untitled project, we see several different windows and a bunch of different toolbars. So this main window here is called the Viewport. And the Viewport is basically where all your models are going to be. When you start assembling things and building different 3D models, that's where that'll be. All of your lights will show up there. Every other object in your scene is going to show up there. And that's another term that is frequently used, is this is, you're building a scene. So if we look at the toolbar on the right side of the screen, sorry, the left side of the screen, I am 46 years old and still don't know my right from my left. On the left side of the screen, these are the tools that allow you to manipulate the object that you're working on. And these tools, all these toolbars are interactive in the sense that depending on what mode you're working in, the tools will change. So if we look along the top bar, this top bar, these are all the different modes we can work in, and other information that's more about navigation and maybe locking motion. So you can see there's this X, Y, Z. If you have not done anything in 3D space before on a computer, there are three axes that are used, that determine what direction you're moving your object. And this is all based on 3D models are basically a whole bunch of points in 3D space that are connected. And so those points will each have an X, Y, and Z value. So Y is green and vertical, X, you'll see, is red and points one direction in the ground plane. Z is blue and points another direction in the ground plane. And typically when we build things, we always think of Y as up. And if we, later in the course, we're going to get into physics a little bit, Gravity works with Y being the axis where, gravity will fall, objects will fall this way. So it's always best to understand X and Z as your ground plane and Y as your vertical, your height. The other thing, this point right here is called the origin, and that is 0, 0, 0, So we have points along the arrow this way that are increasing in size and value, and here they go -1, -2, -3, whatever, all the way into infinity. And the same goes for Y and Z, This is the positive Z direction, this is the negative Z direction, positive Y, negative Y. Okay, so those are the three axes. These buttons basically allow us to lock motion into one of those axes, and we'll look at that once we create an object. Up here, all of these buttons are different modes, and the modes are essentially like at what level of refinement can we edit the model we're working on, right? In model mode, it basically treats the object as a solid thing that we can drag around the scene. In polygons mode, if the object is an object that has polygons we can edit, which we'll get into later, that mode means that we can select individual polygons on the surface of an object and move those around independently of the rest of the model. Edges mode, surprisingly enough, is edges, and points mode is surprisingly enough the vertices or the points that that make up the sides of the polygons, and we'll look at what that means here in a second. And then texture mode we'll get into later, but that's when we start adding textures. It allows us to manipulate how the texture is applied to the object. This other mode here, enable access, we're going to talk about this several times. The quick key for this ends up being like the most frustrating thing in the whole history of all quick keys, because you can accidentally touch it or click it when you're trying to do something else, and then suddenly you can't move any models. Your axis is moving, but you can't move any models, and you get really, really frustrated until you realize that you accidentally pressed the letter L somehow on the keyboard. So, so that's just something to note. I'm going to say that many, many times throughout our course. These other things are snapping. We'll talk about that later, or work planes. Not going to worry about those right now. The axis and soft selection, we're not going to get into that quite yet. Symmetry is something we'll use more, not right away, but soon. And then there's this viewport solo and automatic. Basically what that means is, like, if I was to select this button, then only the object I have selected is going to be visible. Everything else will be hidden, which can be really useful. And automatic, it's sort of a dynamic thing. Sometimes it chooses to do it, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't really matter. There's these other three. These are our render buttons. So in this course and in 3D software, there's two things that you typically do. You model objects and apply textures to those objects. And then, but that's not the end state for most things, unless you're going to export that to make it a 3D printed object or something like that. Usually then you need to go and render it. And rendering is a whole other step. It's essentially like taking a photograph of the scene and exposing that photograph would be the best way to describe it. And so we'll get into that later, but these are our render settings. And then there's this little tiny button here. This is the Material Manager button. And what it does is it basically hides or shows our Material Manager. So if I click on that, you can see that it shrinks our viewport. And then once we start creating materials to apply to our objects, to give them some color and texture and all of that, that's where all of those materials will be kept. But I honestly really like that they hid this. It used to be visible, but they've made it so we have a lot more real estate available for our viewport, which is great. The tools on this side of the window, of the viewport, are our tools for creating objects. So if I was just to click on this cube, it's going to create a cube, and by default, it will create that cube in the center of our universe, the origin point, right? 0, 0, 0. And then this is what these are called parametric primitives or primitives. And what they are is they're basically preset objects that are commonly used, and they're a great way to start building things instead of just going straight from using a polygon and going from there. And so we have a bunch of different, you can see there's a bunch of different options. And to access the rest of these, you just click and hold to see these. The option above this, these are splines. And splines are not visible when you render things, but we use splines to build different types of models and things. And we'll look at how splines get used in the third or fourth tutorial. Below that is the text spline, which again, it's a spline object, but it allows us to do text, and it has a whole font library and everything. It's pretty great. And then these middle objects here that are green, these are called generators. And what generators do is they take some basic geometry that we've put in, and they generate something based on that. And so there's a whole bunch of different options under each of these. This middle one is the volume builder. We will talk about that much later. We're going to be primarily, at least in the first couple tutorials, we'll use this. We'll use several items from here. And then the cloner is its own thing, and there's a bunch of other generators under here that are all things that are called MoGraph, which just is short for motion graphics. And then below that, there are these purple objects. These are called deformers. And deformers basically allow you to take geometry and do something to it. So if I was to apply a twist to this cube, nothing happens, excitingly enough, right? And that's mainly because this angle's 0, but also you can see if I adjust that, right, it starts to twist this geometry. And we'll talk about how to make this more exciting and interesting as we go. Okay. So, and then as we go further down, these are called effectors. We're not going to worry about those until we get a little further in the course. And then there are fields, and fields and effectors are basically additional ways to programmatically impact our geometry or different effects that we're doing. Below that, we have our lights and environment things, and these are and cameras, and these are other things that we're not going to worry about right yet. But once we get through the modeling tutorials, we'll start looking at lighting and materials and things like that. Okay. So the other windows in here are they call them managers. And so this is the object manager. This would be like the takes manager. This is the attributes manager, and and underneath that is the layers manager. So, right, there's different tabs here. Takes is something we're not really going to make use of in this course, but the objects manager is crucial. This is your hierarchy of objects. This is every object that's going to be in your scene, every camera, light, etc., is all going to be here. And then the attributes manager is the attributes of whatever item, object, or tool that you have selected. So if I click on this cube, you'll see that, right, I have certain object attributes. And I can come in here and I could say, let's make the X size 400 centimeters. Right, so it's going to expand that. The segments in our current view is not going to make any sense, and we're not going to worry about that quite yet. But fillet, if I check mark that, you'll see it actually rounds those corners. And so these all have, every object that we create has certain parameters or attributes, and they are going to be different. So if I create a sphere, you'll see that I still have some attributes, but it's not, not quite as many as I had for that cube. Let's see here. And there's all these different tabs, right? So there's the object tab, which is where the specific properties for this object are. The Phong tag we'll talk about later. And then the coordinates is basically you can numerically enter where you want this object to be in space. You can set a very specific number of degrees for each axis of rotation. And the last one is scale. So you can just scale the object up. So if I was to just say, 2 here, and let's do 4 in this other one, right? So I can already use scale to start scaling this object up. And sometimes that works really well. Other times it's better to set those values with, in the object tab, but scale in this case works really well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave my beautiful whatever shape this is, and my cube set like this. Once we've got a couple objects in our scene, there's a couple different ways we can move them, and there's some navigation stuff we need to look at. So in the viewport, there's two things we can do. We can move objects, and 2, we can move the camera that's looking at the objects. Right? You'll see that there's some text here in the center of the screen that says default camera. Whenever we create a scene, whenever we're looking in the viewport, we're always looking through a camera. And we can create multiple cameras and choose which one we're looking at. So if there's like a certain angle we want to render our image, render our scene from, we can have a camera there and we can lock the position of that camera so it stays put. And then we can use the default camera or another camera to actually be modeling and adjusting things and trying to get things right so that when we go and render through that other camera, everything looks good. But we're always looking through a camera. So you just imagine our viewport, we're like looking through a camera at this 3D space, that's this virtual 3D space. So to move the camera, there are several options. You can see it just says move camera with this hand up here. There's scale camera, orbit camera, and then toggle active view. So toggling active view, what this does is if I click on this, it's actually going to give us 4 views of our scene. It'll give us our perspective, and it tells you which one each one is. This is the top view, front view, and right view. And that's just the default settings. You'll notice that these are wireframe views, which can be really useful when you're trying to align things. And these cameras are very much oriented, flat to one of the planes, right? So the front camera is looking at what we would call the XY plane, because the red X and the Y are visible. The blue plane is pointing straight at us, right? The Z is pointing straight at us. In this one, right, we're looking at the YZ plane, right? Because the red is pointing at us, but the Y and the Z are not. And up here, we're looking at the XZ plane because the Y is pointing directly at the camera. Okay. So now, let's see here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pop back to perspective view. If we click on any of the gray bars before we do that, if we click on any of the gray bars, you'll see you get like a very subtle like gray halo around the window. That means this is the one that's currently selected. So if I was to then click on this toggle active view button, it's going to pop me into that view as my only view when I go back. All right, so I want to make sure if I switch views, I want to click back here, and then I want to pop this back. Oops, I clicked the wrong one. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to pop this. Oh, I keep doing the same thing. You'd think I would learn. Notice that each one of these views now has the tools here. So I need to actually select the correct one to pop back into full size. You'd think I had not used this software for 15 years or something, but I have. Okay, so to move the camera, you can either click and drag around from one of these tools. So if I click on the hand here, right, that's going to allow me to kind of move my camera around. It keeps the orientation, and you can kind of see that little cross in the middle. That's the center of the camera, right? That's the center of the view. If I click on this other one and slide either left or right, I think, or up or down. Yep. Yeah, left or right or up or down. That will zoom in and zoom out on my scene. If I click on this other one, this orbit camera, that's going to rotate the camera in the world, right? So I'm rotating around this object, and I'm rotating around the center point of the camera, although right now I think it's just rotating around the origin. Sometimes that changes depending on where you click, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other way that I can do this, right, Cinema4D has a boatload of quick keys, of shortcuts that we can use. And so the shortcuts for moving our camera, scaling our camera, and orbiting our camera are the 1, 2, and 3 keys on the keyboard. So if I hold down 1 and click and drag, I'm going to move the camera around. If I hold down 2 and click and drag, I'm going to zoom in and out. If I hold down 3 and click and drag, I'm going to orbit around wherever the mouse was, or whichever object I had selected, right? So you can kind of see I clicked over there, and now I'm rotating the camera around that corner of the box. If I was to click more centrally, if I was to hold down 3 and click, right, it's going to orbit around the center of the object a little bit better. All right, so that's the basic navigation of how to move the camera around. So let's look at how we move objects around. So if we want to move an object around the scene, the first thing we want to do is select it. Now, if there's a direct line of sight between the object and the camera, right? If there's nothing blocking it, like right here, I can't select this. If the sphere was totally hidden by the cube, I wouldn't be able to select it here. But because it's visible and I can see it, I can click on it and select it. And you'll see that when I select something, it gets this nice little highlight in orange. Once I've selected it, then I can use the axis tool here, right? This is my axis. There's my 3 planes, and I can drag. If I click on any one of the arrows, I can move it, and it's basically locked into motion in that one direction, right? So it's only going to move along the x-axis or the z-axis or the y-axis. If I want to move it, say, along a plane, like let's say I want to move this along the ground plane, what I do is I hover over these little triangles that are here. And you can see this one's like hard to see because it's pretty flat right now. But if I was to hold down the number 3 and rotate my view a little bit, right, it becomes a bit more visible. And you'll see that it highlights in white whatever axes I'm going to be moving this in. So if I wanted to move this around the ground plane, right, now I can do this, and you can see that I'm moving it all over the space. I want you to note, go ahead and look at the attributes manager while I do this, and you'll see that the x, y, and z position, or p.x, p.y, p.z, are moving as well currently, right? So they're updating whenever I update this. Right? And so you can go ahead and just move this around, play. If you have an object selected and you click off in space, it will move in all 3 dimensions at once. I don't suggest doing that because, right, we're working on a 2-dimensional plane. Whether you're using a mouse or a trackpad, you're working in 2 dimensions. Cinema4D is then trying to interpret that into 3 dimensions. And when that happens, and the way perspective works and things, it's really hard to know exactly where you're placing this. And you might be like, oh, it's in the perfect spot. Then you rotate your camera and you realize you've pushed this object in, like, far into the background, or right, something is not right at all. So I suggest not using that unless absolutely necessary, because it's just really hard to wrap your head around where it's going, because it's translating the up, down, left, right motion that you're doing with your mouse or trackpad into X, Y, Z, and it's unpredictable at best. Okay, so we can move objects around. Woo! We can move our camera around. Fantastic. We can create objects. Something to note, what I had said earlier, there's these tools here, right? So this is our move tool. Right? This is the one that you default to, that we've been set to. If I click on that tool one more time, you'll see it's highlighted in purple. Anything that's highlighted in purple means that it's the current active state. Right? So this is a currently active tool. Also, if you notice, if you hover over something, for most of the tools, the shortcut will show up. So the letter E that's down below there, that means the letter E is the key on the keyboard you use to use the move tool. 3 of the tools we use most frequently are going to be move, rotate, and scale. And so it's E, R, and T, right? And rotate's the only one that actually makes sense in terms of the name of the tool. But the reason they do that is because we use them so frequently, and it's really nice to have, you can just have your 3 fingers on the keyboard ready to go on E, R, and T, rather than clicking on these tools over here. So, so if I have the move tool selected, you'll notice there are some options here, and we're not going to worry about what all of these options do at this point. But just note that there are things, and a lot of them are grayed out because we're using primitives. If I then click on the rotate tool, or if I hit the letter R on the keyboard, you'll see that my axis changes to a sphere with 3 colored bands around it. And so if I click on one of those bands, right, I'm going to get rotation around that axis, right? So the green band rotates around the y-axis. The blue band rotates around the blue axis, and the red band rotates around the x-axis, right? The blue axis is Z. And so I can use this as a pretty precise tool to rotate things. If I hold down Shift while dragging, and actually you have to click on the band first and then hold shift, it'll snap in 5-degree increments. So I get a little bit more control that way. Again, if I was to select this cube object by clicking on it here, or I can just click on it again in the object hierarchy, you'll see that I've got these degrees set here, and I can change them numerically. I can select that, and I can just say, oh, I actually want this to be at 20 degrees in this orientation for whatever reason. You can also just, if you click on one of these fields and drag, you can also just slide back and forth through those values in any one of these fields. One of the things I really love about Cinema4D is that there are about 8,000 ways to do everything. And so you can find a system that's like efficient for you. You don't have to be like, oh, I have to go over here and click on this every single time I want to do something. I can hit the letter W to, or sorry, not W, I can hit the letter E, right, and go to my move tool, hit the letter R, maybe do a couple more rotations. And then the letter T is the scale tool. And so, right, we scaled this object, or we scaled the sphere, right, but we have this X, Y, and Z scale. With a primitive, the scale tool is going to uniformly scale the object, right? If we want to adjust these things independent of one another, we can go in here and say, I want this to be 2, right? And then once we've got that set, then it's still going to, right, scale it uniformly. It'll just keep the ratio of the 1 to 2 the same. These yellow edges and dots here, and you'll notice if I click on the sphere, I just have 1. What those do is that's actually controlling if I go to the object tab on one of these and I click on my sphere and I click on this little whitish yellowish dot here, you'll see that's actually increasing and decreasing the radius of my sphere. If I go to my cube, right, this is how with the cube I can actually adjust the size X, size Y, and size Z from the viewport, right? So for primitives, this is, one of the ways that we work, right? So E, R, and T are really useful keys to remember. If you don't remember them, we can always go here. And you can always also, again, right, go to the coordinates tab in your attributes for your object, and you can just slide any of these back and forth to make adjustments. And I think it's right and left is the way that you slide those. Up and down doesn't really work on those. Okay, what else do we need to cover before we are done? For the first tutorial, we're really going to stay in model mode because with primitives, we cannot independently adjust polygons or points or any of that. We can only, if it's a rectilinear cube, it's going to stay a rectilinear cube. We're not going to be able to drag it into some other shape in its current state. And for the first modeling tutorials, we're going to be building an object just solely with primitives in order to get used to the interface and kind of see how to sketch things out. And we'll use a couple other tools or generators, one called bool that allows us to take one object and cut away from another or unite them together, and then a couple others to finish that out. The last thing is down at the bottom. This is a bar that we're not really going to be using anytime in the near future, but this is the playhead. So Cinema4D, along with being a modeling program, is also an animation program. And so when you animate things and keyframe things, right, this is your playhead, and this allows you to animate position and stuff over time. But we're not getting into that for quite a while. There is one last thing, which are these different layouts up here. There are several different layouts, and they're basically just meant so that depending on what you are working on, groom, we don't need groom at all, but depending on what you're working on, they have different things brought to the foreground. and maybe different tool sets available on the sides here. I do want you to note if we click on, say I'm in model mode right now and I click on polygon mode, I want you to note that there's a lot of grayed out tools here because I have a primitive selected currently, but that whole tool set has changed because these are tools that are used to manipulate polygons. If I click on edges, it's going to change slightly. If I click on points, it's going to change slightly again. Because again, each one of these modes has different tools that you use and then other tools that you don't. In the past, all the tools were always available, and then you just wouldn't use some or would use some. And I think this is a much more efficient use of space. Yeah. Okay, so that's the basic interface. One last thing, we could save this beautiful project that we made. So I'm going to go ahead and go down to File. And if you're in Windows, right, the menu, all of these options are a little bit lower. They're actually in the window. I want you to note that there are headers for many of these other panels too. You'll see that each one has like slightly different settings, depending on, what is useful there. And we'll look at some of these more in depth as we go on. Garage shading lines is really useful. It actually shows the shading and shows edges. But we are going to go ahead and leave this on garage shading for now. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say File and just go down to Save Project. I do want you, there is one last, there's so many one last things. There is one last thing that's really important. Cinema4D is the only program I've ever used that has a consistent habit of corrupting files. One of the best things that you can do is, instead of just saving your project, there's two things you can do. You can either say save incremental. So what that will do is that you have your base project saved as like my awesome project. And then what it'll do is it'll say my awesome project.1, my awesome project.2, my awesome project.3 if you do a save incremental. So it keeps your old work and then saves a new file that you will continue to work off of, right? That way, if one of those incremental saves ends up getting corrupted, then you can step back one increment. The other thing I suggest you do, especially if you're working on your own machine, I can't remember if the lab computers revert this when they restart, but if you go to Preferences, and there are a lot of preferences, you want to go to Files, and you're going to want to say, that you want to auto save. So check that box every 5 minutes and limit to 10 copies is fine. And you want to save it to the project folder, right? There's different places you can save it, but that's usually the easiest path. And yeah, that's like a key thing to set. Because what that does is, right, every 5 minutes, it's going to be saving a copy of your file. You don't even have to think about it. And then again, you have these backups. So if something terrible happens, you should be able to recover one of the backups. And terrible things happen all the time. Cinema, you'll do something and you might slide a slider into a place where your computer just can't possibly handle the amount of math you're asking it to do, and Cinema will crash. And when it crashes, there's a good chance that you may not be able to use the file again. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough that I feel like it's really important to protect yourself as much as possible against this, because it really sucks if you've spent like a week and a half working on something and then the file is corrupted and you have to start over from scratch. Okay. In the next tutorial, we are going to start actually modeling. So I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. And you just say Save Project. And the projects are going to be saved as Cinema4D projects. I'm just going to do this in this old folder. But it's just a .c4d file is the basic file you'll save. And I'm just going to say funtime 1 and save it. Once we get a little bit further, there are assets that we're going to be having. We'll have texture files and things like that that we need to save with it. And we'll talk more in depth about how to save all of that together so it automatically generates a file structure and everything moves in one place so you don't lose your textures or anything like that.